Daniel, welcome.
Nice to be here, John.
I want to thank you so much for your piece, and I have to ask you, tell me about the title.
Okay. It's a Japanese haiku, and it's Yato Itogo Tota Hari no Kanshoku. And it means feel of the needle once you get the needle through it. The idea of feeling the needle once you get the needle through ostensibly fabric or something like that is kind of the way I was approaching the PARTCH instrumentation. And with all this Japanese stuff in my mind and the idea of using the PARTCH Ensemble for that, collaboration, that piece is a kind of an, not sure whether to call it an opera or a theater piece. But anyway, the PARTCH instruments were part of that. And so in order to do a shorter piece, as kind of working with these instruments for the first time, it was kind of like, feeling a needle through it with these unusual tunings and unusual instruments. And so with the limitation on the ensemble to 3 players, I had the idea of working with the adapted viola and the diamond marimba and the harmonic canon 1. And so, one was basically pluck string, the other one is bowed string, and then there was a mallet instrument, and they were all sort of more or less within the same range too. And dynamically, I thought, okay, how do I balance these instruments? And how do I work with the tonal world that PARTCH obviously created, but also the timbral world that among the instruments that I chose. And so it was very much for me the whole feeling for myself, and the haiku sort of spoke to that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about writing for those instruments, because you're a trained musician.
Right.
You never took a class in composing for PARTCH instruments before.
Never, no.
It's a whole new world, let alone the language, the microtonality.
Right, the notation.
The notation. I mean, there's so many hurdles to get over to actually create something. How did you handle that? What did you write first?
Well, fortunately, you brought over the Harmonic Canon, and I learned how to play it. Of course, I was never an expert at it. And once you've got your hands on the thing, I mean, you do your best. And
did the instrument tell you what it wanted you to write for it?
Well, it's funny that, yes, in some ways that's true. But, also not so true, because, as it spoke to Partch and how he composed for it was very different from the way I treated those instruments. And so it didn't really, it was a kind of give and take. And I had to negotiate what it is I heard those instruments and what those instruments wanted to do. I mean, the performing limitations are, every instrument has its performing limitations.
Of course.
And not being very, very facile with it. The only thing that I could do is try to figure out, how I can very, very slowly, maneuver around it, and imagine that, I'm probably the worst player in the world at it, and, anybody who has more experience is going to be able to do a better job. So I figured that what I can do, slowly, is what a better player like you could do more quickly. And so, I tried also not to make things too different over the course of the piece, so that, in other words, you were repeating patterns.
Good for the listener, too.
And
Which brings up the question of form, because there's a lot of space in the piece. And it sort of reminds me of some of the most elegant brush paintings of Japanese calligraphy.
Right, right.
I'm wondering, did the haiku, is the form of a haiku being in 3 lines and certain syllables, did that also inform what was going on, perhaps rhythmically or formally?
You know, that's interesting. Maybe on an unconscious level. Maybe actually that's partially why I was drawn to haiku in terms of the title of the piece. Yeah, you know, I hadn't given that, you know, too much thought. I liked the haiku. It seemed to make sense to me in terms of the way I was handling the material, so maybe formally too. But I think actually, in terms of the space in the piece, I think that the space made sense to me just because the harmonies were so unusual. And they were also, as you pointed out to me when you got the piece, they're not Partch harmonies either.
No, no.
You know? And so I really wanted to hear them. I didn't want them, you know, to be...
To drive by quickly?
Right, exactly, yeah. And I also felt that in some ways, you know, I was moving things around, so in slightly different contexts, they were heard slightly differently. And I just needed the space. The piece needed the space. The ear needed the space.
Yes,
and,
yes.
And so, you know, the space was...
Space was used.
Space was...
And it was used
was
well.
given, yeah.
So this was... It turned out to be a COVID project, but it wasn't designed that way. In fact, we were scheduled to perform this live in Disney Hall's Red Cat Theater. And all of a sudden, the pandemic bumped its way into our lives, and it didn't even allow you, as the composer, to sit in a room with us and tell us about how to interpret the piece.
Right.
Very different experience for a composer. Was that frustrating?
In this case, not so, strangely enough, because I felt, well, you know, we talked, and I think that you conveyed to me also what some of the other players were experiencing in terms of learning it.
Yes.
And I think that, I mean, because you're really, you know, the experts on, you know, these instruments. I was mostly just curious to hear how the piece would come together really without me. And did. So it worked out great.
Well, let's hear a needle going through, perhaps.
Let's.
Do we feel it on the other end? Let's find out.
Okay. Thanks, John.